Esteemed Minister, Mr. President, esteemed guest, we're moving on with today's very, very interesting agenda, and we had the opportunity to discuss investment, we had the opportunity to discuss human capital, and I would also like to put a very important factor in the equation, that factor being logistics and supply chain. And I'm honored to be having this fireside chat conversation with Mr. Scott Kutz. I think I got it right.
You got it correct, thank you.
Who is the Senior Vice President of Operations for Philip Morris International. We had the opportunity to have a small chit-chat before the panel, and I was astonished by how far he has traveled and what an important global perspective he has on supply chain, on logistics, and all those challenges or opportunities that have arisen, especially during the post-COVID era. And I would like to start our discussion with this. And you do have a very unique global perspective as the Vice President for PMI's for global operations in a number of fields and in numerous countries. So to kick off the conversation, I would like to ask you, what do you think are the most significant factors that determine the global supply chain, especially during the last 5 years, especially during the post-COVID era? We saw numerous paradigm shifts in very short time frame. And in what ways have you adapted your operations in order to become and actually remain resilient and competitive in this hugely changing world? Our topic is resilience through diversification, and I guess you have done a lot of things in this direction.
Yes, I think a fantastic question. And firstly, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It's a great honor. I think, let me share a secret about supply chain professionals. So supply chain professionals love to fix problems, and they love crises. And I think, the era of the COVID pandemic, as well as the war in Eastern Ukraine, forced us to take a step back and to say, it's great that we love to fix problems, but how can we bring an element from being reactive to proactive and anticipating some of the things that happen? And I think it was a real wake-up call. If you think before the pandemic, the world was very predictable. You could take a lot of risk on the supply chain in terms of inventories, in terms of the supply base, because the world was repetitive and it was predictable, and we had that environment that allowed that. Now, post the COVID pandemic and the war in Eastern Ukraine, it's really taught us that instead of being excellent in responsiveness, we need to be excellent in anticipation. And that's one of the big shifts that has really come through. And I think that has really helped to reframe much of the thinking that happens around how do you run a global supply chain, but also how do you ensure that not only do you have global sufficiency, regional sufficiency, as well as local sufficiency, but also factoring in what are some of these emerging things that are coming on terms of risk and resilience in a value chain. So I'd like today to talk about two things. One is geopolitics, and the second is climate change. And I think they're very much real examples, and I think I'll give some flavor on how do we do that in Philip Morris International, and how does that relate down to on the ground here in Greece with Papastratos. So one of the exercises we do now is we do a regular review of what we call emerging risks. And obviously geopolitics and climate change are part of that. And we start to build what I would call do-nothing scenarios, all the way through to gray to extreme black scenarios, and really map those out and say, what is likely to happen? And if we think about the world of uncertainty, some things are predictable that they might happen, but you may not know the exact outcome. Other things could happen, and you need to have options. And that's really one of the key things that we build out there. So, giving a bit more example around, geopolitics. I think, some of the election results we've seen with, recent events, but also some of the geopolitical games that are happening between, some of the Asian countries and other powers in the world. Those things are having real material impacts, whether it's tariffs, whether it's in relation to export controls, and they're things that we start to build in those different scenarios. And, a business like Philip Morris and Papastratos is a very complex value chain. We have electronics sourced primarily out of Asia. We have tobacco, which is sourced globally in different parts of the world. but we also have materials, and we also obviously have our production facilities. So applying those different grades of scenarios gives us that ability to say, either we have a clear plan of action, and that drives some of our strategic decisions. And when I say strategic decisions, it's decisions which impact 3, 4, 5 years out. And that could be around which suppliers do we use? Do we develop additional suppliers? Do we need to develop capacity or capabilities in different regions? Do we have sufficiency of supply in a regional basis or in a country position? And they're things that we work through, and we have a clear map of those, but ultimately it helps to guide those overall strategic decisions. Now, bringing that back to a more here and now position, it also helps us to identify in advance many of what I will call tactical decisions. So a good example was the war in the Middle East of recent times. We had scenarios already ready to go. We were ready for that. When it happened, people knew what to do. And I think, that type of thinking is not what we used to do in the past. It was very much wait for the crisis, be the heroes and go and solve those problems. Now we have a suite of things where we know this is probably going to happen. There probably will be a war in the Middle East. What could be the potential consequences, but what are the actions that we would need to take? And I think that's one of the significant changes that I've seen at a global level, which I think, wasn't there before we had those major destabilization issues with COVID and with the war in Ukraine. Now, bringing that back to a local level, I think this is where we also look at how do we build resiliency in the countries that we operate. And I think I'd like to really highlight the work that the Papastratos team is doing here, because it really comes through with some fantastic results. And starting with what are some of those challenges that are in Greece. So climatic events are becoming more predominant. We see the notion of wildfires, we see drought. We also see the challenges around the energy availability, both in terms of price, but also the conversion from traditional gas into renewables. So one of the great things that we also focus on is to say, how can we be more resilient through sustainability activities? And I think we've got the team here, which is great to see, and to their credit, some high-level facts in terms of what they've been able to achieve over the last 3 years: a 48% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, and a 42% reduction in energy, and a 42% reduction in water. Now, there's a clear business impact with that, a financial impact. So sustainability does link with business performance, but it also makes those operations more resilient for the longer term. And that's the type of mitigation and adaptation that we also apply across the value chain of what are those material risks that come, but also how can we diversify and ensure that mitigation and adaptation is also a key part of our overall supply chain resilience plan.
And I have a follow-up question on that. During the last 5 years, actually all hell broke loose, starting from COVID, wars, tariffs, what have you. What are the lessons learned? I guess we must have learned a lot during this time frame. And how do you implement these lessons, both on a strategic level, but also on a tactical level?
Yeah, I think the first lesson is it gives you lots of gray hair. But look, to be honest, we were totally unprepared for COVID. I think, the teams did an amazing job to react, but it wasn't sustainable. People were working literally 24 hours a day for months on end to solve that. I think, this notion of how do you have excellence in preparedness is really a doctrine and a mandate that we really apply. And I think you can't know all the answers, but you need to have options in the plan as a minimum, or you need to have plans in place for potential or likely events. And I think that would be my advice to any supply chain company, is be prepared. And I think that's a topic, if you think 4 or 5 years down the track, if you ask me, will it get better? Will it get easier? I think the answer is no. So it's a capability to bring. It's a topic that needs, various inputs. It's not something that a supply chain or an operations organization can do it alone. Gather different perspectives, gather a different, what are the known knowns, what are the unknown knowns, but really select and get different inputs from as broad as possible community and stakeholders to better understand what could happen. And I think that's really that excellence in preparedness will come as an outcome of that.
So more or less prepare for the unexpected.
Yes. Or at least have options that should something bad go wrong, that you can move forward.
And I guess that's a multifaceted approach because, as you said before, you need to reach out to communities, you need to reach out to vendors, you need to reach out to everybody involved in the chain so as to get as much input as possible.
Correct.
So let us shift from the global perspective and come back to Greece.
Yes.
You did mention a few things about Greece, but Greece is a major investment for PMI International, and almost 10 years ago, it was 2017, you started this investment in the Aspropios factory. You've definitely put your money where your mouth is. You have invested something in the range of 700 million euros in Greece. So what does this investment, what is the role that this investment plays in your global perspective, in your global plans, related but not only limited to supply chain?
I think a fantastic question, and I think it was great in the previous panel to hear some of the things that I see exactly for Greece. And I think the first one is about how do we create regulation and regulation certainty. Now, maybe just to give you a bit of context, PMI, Philip Morris International, over the last 17 years has invested $14 billion into innovation around smoke-free products, so tackling the core issue with cigarette smoking, which is the combustion, backed by scientific research, backed through commercial activities to offer adult smokers who would otherwise continue to smoke cigarettes. And that's a big investment. And you imagine Papastratos, where almost 95 years of history, predominantly all that time a cigarette factory producing cigarettes and tobacco products. There was a big, bold move by PMI to say, we want to convert our factory to stop making conventional cigarettes, combustible cigarettes, and to move to smoke-free. Now, we did that in a space of really not a lot of regulation. And I think this has been one of the great successes of the investments in Greece, is that there's been an ongoing collaboration together with authorities to create regulatory certainty, but also to create the regulatory frameworks that balance the interest of public health, but also to create those spaces of what are novel tobacco products, what are novel nicotine products, and how can we make sure that legal age nicotine users or smokers can be educated on the awareness of those products, but also that we differentiate and we recognize the notion of tobacco harm reduction. So educating consumers about what are the choices. Obviously, if people are concerned about smoking, they should quit as a primary cause. But if people want to continue to use nicotine, having a framework around tobacco harm reduction is obviously a very progressive way to do that, but also to differentiate those products versus a combustible cigarette through differentiated taxation is also an important thing. Now, if we bring that back to the $700 million investment, we did that on the basis without having that regulatory framework in place. And I think to the credit of the Greek government and the Greek community to come with a pragmatic but also a progressive view to regulation that allows us today in Papastratos to have 84% of what we produce today is exported. So quite a significant export value of more than 400 million euros, but also a significant economic contribution to the Greek economy through more than €1 billion per annum of excise tax and VAT contribution. So, I think that's really a big bet that we did as a company, but I think it's also a big bet on Greece, but also a big space in terms of how can we evolve and regulate, but also innovate together. Because I think, as we move forward, there will be new categories of nicotine-containing products, and having that space to be able to continue to innovate and to build regulation that is pragmatic, but also, recognizes the harm of smoking and youth prevention of smoking and use of nicotine is also a very, pragmatic and progressive way of regulating.
So did the bet pay off at the end of the day? It was a big bet. So are you happy with that? And are you going to continue betting?
Absolutely.
Or not betting anymore, but rather making, calculated decisions?
Yeah, I think, we still have a 200 million euros investments happening today. We have construction happening at the factory, expanding capacity to add more equipment in there. I think that's a fantastic, recognition of the success of Papastratos and Greece. I think, as we move forward as well, this is new technology, and I think, I also would reinforce from what I heard in the previous group is not only regulatory certainty, but also that education and the availability of talents is one of the key things. So you imagine one day you're making cigarettes, the next day you're making smoke-free. We've just finished or coming to the completion of a complete upgrade of that technology as well. And that involves a high quest for learning. And we see that through, over the last 2 years, 130,000 hours of our employees upskilling and training on new technology, new processes. And I think, that's also, I think, one of the parts that makes Greece stand out as a talent pool is the inquisitiveness to learn, the inquisitiveness to innovate. And I think, they really are great strengths. And that's obviously a reason why we continue to invest in Greece.
So given the results of this investment and given the geopolitical perspective, you would give a positive vote for Greece as an investment destination?
Yes, absolutely. I think our money talks. So, but I think, the big credit to the team. I think, it's really amazing to see the transformation. And I think, it hasn't been easy. It's been a challenge, but I think, that's also the resilience of the Greek population to adversity, but to rise above that really shines through.
So I'd like to once again step back and move to what I might call the elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is AI.
Yes.
And it's a big elephant.
Yes.
And in many rooms.
Yes.
So let's stick to our case. My understanding is that AI has affected and is going to affect supply chain in numerous ways. To be a little bit provocative, do you think that we'll be having this discussion in 2 or 3 years with a person or with an AI agent? And in what ways will it affect your way of doing business? But also, what should everybody have in mind regarding the use of AI in logistics and supply chain, but also on a broader spectrum?
Yeah, I think maybe let me give a couple of perspectives on this one. And I start with a bit of a reality check on AI. I think some of you may have heard of, there was recently an MIT survey about 95% of companies fail in AI. There's no business return, there's no impact. Now, does that mean we shouldn't explore AI? Absolutely not. I think given what I've already said about the complexity of the world, the ability to innovate, but also to bring complex information together is really where AI can make a big difference. Now, the companies that succeed in AI use AI and technology to transform their business processes. The 95% that are failing are just applying AI to what exists today from a business process perspective. So there is a big place in the world, particularly in supply chain, particularly when you take lots of information across, whether it's sensing of data from consumer offtake or other elements early or down the value chain, all the way through your manufacturing and upstream supply chain, bringing those complex pieces of data together and using AI to build insights, to make decision support, and to make early analysis and predictability of things that a human can't see, but also to aggregate those silos of information that exists still today in many supply chains. Now, I give you a real practical example today where we're using AI in Philip Morris. And this is I hear a lot about it, people fear that this may change their job or make it, the job would disappear. And one of those, and it's in the supply chain world, we use things like materials requirements planning. We always need to review safety stock of finished goods and materials inventories. And one of the examples of where we're using AI in Philip Morris and Papastratos is we start to use AI tools to have dynamic inventory planning. Now, in the past, if you're a planner, one of the biggest pains you have in your life is reviewing the safety stock policies. It's such a pain that you only do it probably once every year, and by the time you do it, it's wrong. Now, with AI, we're able to use that. We're able to review that using AI, and what it actually does is it comes back to the materials requirements planners, and it actually says, based off this, I believe you should change your inventory to X from Y. And it says, and it actually gives you an explanation of that. And what it does is it says to the planner, do you accept it? So you still have the human in the loop as part of that. And then the human says, either I accept it or if I don't accept it, I need to explain why. And it helps the model to learn. But it still has the human in the loop. But there, it's a good example of where AI can actually help us to go and manage what is a very complex topic, not a very, not a topic that anyone really likes to do, but obviously a very, very important topic, particularly when you talk about complex supply chains, when you talk tens of thousands of items available.
So it's definitely a tool that will play an integral part of the way we work. I guess will not be obsolete by AI in the near future, but we need to take into account, and I guess multinationals need to invest a lot in order to achieve that. Okay, there is a huge percentage of failure, but those victories are going to be immense.
Yeah, and I think, I hear a lot when people talk about AI is it's going to eliminate people. I think when you think, for me, the real opportunity when I look at AI is how do we grow the top line? How do we grow the business with, having those insights to be able to do better than our competition? And I think that competitive advantage is what will ensure that we maintain and preserve employment. I think, it is something that we obviously need to look at, but we also need to focus a lot on data. And that's, I think one of the other big challenges around AI is data in silos, data that's not in a format that can be leveraged through AI is one of the key things that we need to continue to work. So it will happen. I don't think it's going to be as fast as what we imagine, but I think it's also that element as well that's what's important is we need to train and we need to bring people along on this journey because to work with AI is a different skill. It's a very different skill to what we've traditionally learned and used in our existing jobs, but it's certainly something which can help us to grow the business, to be more competitive, and to actually make faster and be more competitive than other countries or other competitors.
So thank you very much for this insightful conversation. We did cover a lot of topics. It's a hugely changing world, but I get a positive note that you're on top of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.